10 of the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Can people hear me in the back? Raise your hand if you can hear me in the back of our classroom. Am I loud enough? Raise your hand if you can hear me. So you can't hear me in the back? If I talk a little louder, can you hear me in the back? 如果你可以听我说的话，麻烦你这样做。所以我知道我是 Can you hear me? Okay, that's all I want to know. Thank you. I just want to make sure I'm talking loudly enough so that everybody can hear me. If I'm not talking loudly enough, it's totally fine to let me know. So if you can't hear me, just raise your hand or wave or something so I know that I'm not loud enough. That's fine. That's completely fine. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 10 of Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution. Kuhn opens with a couple of examples that are really interesting, and they're pretty famous examples. One example, and they're such famous examples that he doesn't show them to you because they're so famous, he thinks you've probably seen them or read about them in other books. But a lot of times, that's not the case. So, one of the examples is called the duck rabbit. This is a version of the duck rabbit. Now, why is it called the duck rabbit? Well, maybe this is obvious, but I'll point it out in case it's not 100% obvious. It's also, I don't draw very well. So if you look this up online on the World Wide Web, you can find a better version of it. But my best version of the duck rabbit is, if you first look at this, to me, the first thing I see is a duck. So this is the bill, the beak of the duck. This is the duck's eye. That's the duck's neck. And, so it's just like whack, whack, it's a duck. That's about it. What is there to it? But what if, instead of these being a bill, what if they're ears? And what if this, instead of this being a duck looking this way, it's a rabbit looking that way? So it could be a duck looking to the left, or it could be a rabbit looking up from our perspective. Now, it's cute, but why is it so important? Well, the example originally comes from a book by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was actually a student of Russell's. So Ludwig Wittgenstein was a student of Russell's originally, but later in their lives, their careers went in very different directions. And later, Wittgenstein rejected the approach which he had had earlier in his career, and which was very similar to Russell's approach. So Wittgenstein uses the example of the duck rabbit in the Philosophical Investigations, and then Thomas Kuhn refers to it in Structure of Scientific Revolutions. What point are they trying to make? The point they're trying to make is that when you see something, you normally see it as something. So you don't just see a bunch of lines. You see a bunch of lines that look to you like a duck. But then, if you look at them in a different way, you see lines that look to you like a rabbit. So the Kuhn is trying to give you an example, a small example, but an example of how you can see the same thing, in some sense, in different ways. So in a way, we want to say it's the same lines, But you can see them as a duck, or you can see them as a rabbit. He also refers to something else, although he doesn't identify it as, he doesn't give you the exact name. So the duck rabbit, Kuhn refers to it pretty clearly, but the other example, he doesn't give you the exact name. This kind of drawing is called a Necker cube. A Necker cube. You've probably, if you're like me, doodled this. Doodle is like to draw, aimlessly on a piece of paper, right? So like, you just like, blah, 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 doodle, So you probably doodled this on a piece of paper just for fun. I do it all the time. But why is it important? It's a drawing of a cube. But here's what I want you to ask yourself. Ask yourself this question. When you look at this square, and I'm emphasizing it right now, is that square the top of a cube, or is it the bottom of a cube? You can see it two different ways if you try. Yeah, you can look at it as above or below. You can see the same cube in two different ways. So you can see this square, that part of the cube, as the top of the cube, and think, oh, I'm looking down into a cube from this angle. Or you could see this as the bottom of the cube and say, oh, okay, let me do it. What am I seeing now? Okay, yeah. So I'm looking at the cube in from here down at that. And notice, it took me a second to find it, right? Why? Because my mind had trained itself to see that square as the top. So I had to think for a second to flip it in my head and see it the other way around. Again, what it's supposed to illustrate is we don't just see lines or images. We see things as something. We see the lines as a cube. We see lines as a duck, or we see them as a rabbit. Let me give you another example. I always found this fascinating. It's not in Kuhn, but one of my colleagues who does philosophy of film told me about it. I audited one of my colleagues' classes on the philosophy of film. And we watched many old films in his course. And I said, and if you watch old films, really old films, you'll see the same thing. This is a technical term in filmmaking, establishing shot. An establishing shot in a film or a movie is when you show something to tell the audience, hey, we're at a college. So if you were making a movie about Wuhan University, you might have an establishing shot where you showed the front entrance to Wuhan University. And you'd say, quick shot, 3 seconds, boom. Or maybe you want to make a movie about the U.S. government. And so you show the White House in Washington, D.C. And you have a quick shot of the White House. That's an establishing shot. I asked my colleague, I said, when you watch really old movies, the establishing shots are so long. In modern movies, the establishing shots are 2, maybe 3 seconds. And if they run longer, you're thinking, what's going on? Why are they showing what's going to happen? In modern movies, establishing shots are really short. Why? I asked my colleague, and he had a very interesting answer. He said, people hadn't learned to watch movies yet. their eyes and their minds were not trained to see movies. You needed to make the movies really slow, or they couldn't visually understand what they were watching. I thought that was fascinating. And he said, now, and this is true of you, I think, I know it's true of me, I was raised on television and movies. I want everything fast. Boom, 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 boom. Don't waste my time. Shot, quick, 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 quick. Action, 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 action. So I can watch something and immediately know what I'm watching. Very quick. But in the old films, establishing shots are very long. Why? The viewers' minds and eyes were not trained to see movies yet. Really cool example. So the point is, you don't just see things, you see them as something. And you get trained to see them a certain way. Another example that Kuhn gives us is an experiment that was performed in which subjects, experimental test subjects, were forced to wear glasses or goggles. What did the glasses or the goggles do? They turned everything upside down. So when the people put on the glasses or the goggles, if I put them on, I would see the floor up there and I would see the ceiling down there. And Kuhn said, what happened when they performed this experiment? At first, the subjects are just like this. They're bouncing on and onto things, and they don't know where anything is. After a few weeks, completely normal. Their eyes adjust to seeing everything upside down. They're completely comfortable with it. Why? Their brain gets trained to see the world upside down. Some of them report the world looks right side up to me now. It doesn't look flipped. It doesn't look like the floor is there and the ceiling's there. It looks like the ceiling's there and the floor's there, even when I have the goggles on. Very surprising. So Kuhn gives all these examples, and he draws a conclusion. He says, this is almost an exact quotation. I'll give it to you first, but then I'll explain it in detail. Kuhn says, the duck rabbit example, and he might have added the Necker cube example, shows that people with the same stimulus can see different things. The inverted lenses example shows that people with a different stimulus can see the same thing. So what's the conclusion Kuhn is ultimately Kuhn is saying both of the following are possible. Kuhn says that the example of the duck rabbit and the Necker cube shows that people can have the same stimulus. What does that mean? The thing that is making you see something, the drawings on the blackboard, or the image on the internet, or the image in the book, is the same for you and for me. But we see or observe different things. I see the bottom of a cube that I'm seeing from above. You you see the top of a cube that you're looking into. I see a duck, you see a rabbit. Then Kuhn says people can have different stimulus, but have the same observation. And he says that's shown by the inverting lenses example. Why? What do the lenses or the glasses or the goggles do? You put them on and it flips. So you see the floor up there and the ceiling down there. But after a while, you become accustomed to it. And so, although we know your stimulus is different, we put glasses on you to change your stimulus, you will observe or see the same thing. I will ask you, where are the lights? Where is the floor? Where did I put my pen? Even when I'm wearing inverting lenses. Now, Kuhn says these don't prove anything by themselves, but they're very suggestive. They're very suggestive. And he gives a very interesting example in astronomy to try and show some of the interesting consequences of these facts. Uranus, and I just, in case, I was kind of curious too. I didn't know how to say Uranus in Chinese. It's Qianhuangshen. That's my new word for today. What Uranus is important. Uranus is important because it's the first new planet that human beings discover. Pretty much every ancient civilization knows there are 5 planets visible from Earth. They have different names for them, of course, but all civilizations know about 5 planets visible from Earth. What's distinctive about planets is that they move among the other stars. The background stars are called fixed stars. The fixed stars actually move too, but they move together. They move in like a big turning sphere, like that, from the perspective of the Earth. The planets move among the other stars. Sometimes the planets come close to each other. When the planets come close to each other, it's called a planetary conjunction. So the planets move among the other stars. Sometimes it turns out they get really close to each other, and that's called a conjunction of the planets. I'm going to mention something that isn't directly relevant to Kuhn, but it's just really, really interesting. I might have the dates slightly wrong, but this is approximately correct. There was a major conjunction of the planets around 1050 BCE. A Chinese historical work says that 10 years later, the Zhou people conquered the Shang people. One of my professors has done a lot of research arguing that we could date the beginning of the Zhou dynasty exactly to 1040 BCE. Why? Because there was a conjunction of planets around 1050, and this historical work says 10 years later, the Zhou people conquered the Shang people. That's pretty cool. But anyway, that's not correct. That's not really cool. If you get interested, I can give you an article that has exact dates and arguments, but anyway. But all early civilizations know about the 5 planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, that are visible from the Earth. And you can see the names for them in Chinese go back to the Wuxin, the 5 phases. They're really ancient names. But Uranus was really interesting because it's the first new planet anybody discovered. So how was it discovered? It was discovered by someone named Herschel. And it turns out that there were at least two important factors in the discovery of Uranus. What were they? One of them was people started to develop better telescopes. Better telescopes. So you needed stronger telescopes to be able to see Uranus. You can't see Uranus just using your eyes. And you can't use a weak telescope. You need a very strong telescope to see Uranus. So one reason people discovered Uranus was better telescopes. But that's not the whole story. Another part of the story is this. Prior to Herschel discovering Uranus, many people were looking in the place in the sky where we know Uranus was visible. Some of them even reported seeing something in that place in the sky that we know must have been Uranus. Some of them even reported it's moving, which means it's not a fixed star, and they said, I guess it's a comet or a meteorite or something. Why? And this happened for a century. For a century, people had telescopes strong enough to see Uranus. They looked in the part of the sky where Uranus had to be. Some of them reported seeing something that had to be Uranus. Some of them noticed it moved like a planet moves. Nobody discovered it. Why did it wait for Herschel? Because the paradigm for several thousand years had been there are 5 visible planets. That's the paradigm. How many planets are there? There's 5. You learn it first day astronomy class. 5 planets. Not now, but back then, first day, 5 planets. So astronomers knew, well, we know whatever I'm looking at, it's not a planet. Why? There's only 5 of them. Why do they think that? It's part of the paradigm. So when Herschel discovered Uranus, originally he didn't believe it was a planet either. It took him a lot of observation and a lot of thought before he said, this has to be a planet. So part of Herschel's breakthrough was the ability to see that something was anomalous under the current paradigm, and then recognize the current paradigm could not account for it, and develop a new paradigm, which is that there's 6 planets. The story gets even more interesting, because after Herschel discovers Uranus, very, very, very quickly, people discover asteroids. What are asteroids? Asteroids are, if you want to call them this, they're almost like small planets. I meant to double check on this before class. I believe asteroids are found generally between Saturn and Uranus, but I could be wrong about that. But there's what's called an asteroid belt, a region in our solar system where there's a bunch of really tiny planets. We're always discovering new ones. They're not part of our regular list of planets because they're so small. Some of them are as big as this room. Some asteroids are the size of this room. Some of them are the size of Wuhan. But, so, again, sorry. So, Again, scientists had telescopes already that were strong enough to see the asteroids, but they did not see them until after Herschel saw Uranus and identified it as a planet. So Kuhn suggests that this is a lot like the anomalous playing card experiment from the earlier chapter. You will recall that in the anomalous playing card experiment, subjects, people who were being tested, were shown playing cards, Western-style playing cards. I explained last time 4 suits in a Western-style playing card deck. I know people often use them in China too, but in the U.S. as well, some of my students in the U.S. don't play cards. So perhaps some of you do not play cards either. But a regular deck has 4 suits. 2 of the suits are black, spades and clubs. 2 of them are red, hearts and diamonds. And the subjects were first shown standard cards and asked to identify them. And then after a while, they slipped in anomalous cards. Red, spades and clubs. Black, hearts and diamonds. And the subjects either misidentified them or were puzzled by them. Usually, after repeated exposure, the subjects would eventually say, "Oh, I see what you did." And then it was very easy to identify 5 clubs, 3 of diamonds, 2 of hearts, because they recognized what they were looking for. So, in this case, astronomers are looking where Uranus is. Sometimes they're even seeing that something about this thing is strange, but they can't see it as a planet. Just like people had trouble seeing a red spade or club or a black heart or diamond. Why? It's not what the paradigm tells you to expect, so it's hard to see. But once you have learned to see what was before unexpected, now it's easy. So once Herschel shows people there are things going around the sun that ancient civilizations never knew about. Things that there's a planet out there we never knew about. There could be other planets out there we never knew about. All of a sudden, they discover asteroids. A lot of them. Using telescopes that were already available. So using telescopes that were already available, earlier astronomers did not see Uranus, but Herschel did. And after Herschel convinced astronomers that Uranus was a planet, it became very easy to identify planet-like things, asteroids, using the very same equipment as before. And that's kind of like the playing card experiment, in that it's hard to see something, even if it should be obvious, if that something violates the paradigm. But then once you learn a new paradigm, it becomes very easy to see something. And it's hard to understand why you couldn't see it before. Now, Kuhn makes some remarks about pendulums. Some of what he says about pendulums is a bit technical. Basically, a pendulum is a weight, and it's attached to some kind of point here. And then when you set the pendulum, if this is straight up and down, if you set the pendulum in motion, it will go back and forth repeatedly. And it turns out, if it were not for friction, if it were not for the friction of this contact point, and if it were not for the friction of air, a pendulum will go forever. if you could find a way to make a frictionless pendulum, it would go on forever. So that's basically what a pendulum is. And one of the points that Kuhn makes is that the way Galileo would see a pendulum is very different from the way Aristotle would see a pendulum. Now, to explain what's important about this, this is really a special case or a special example of a broader disagreement between Aristotle and Galileo. So I'm going to talk about the broader disagreement between Aristotle and Galileo. What's the broader disagreement? Well, we said in an earlier class, part of the disagreement is that Aristotle is concerned with qualitative change in qualities, whereas Galileo is primarily concerned with quantitative change. That is to say, change that can be described using numbers. So Aristotle is primarily interested in qualitative change in the qualities of things, whereas Galileo is primarily interested in quantitative change in the in numerical quantities, things that can be measured. That's one fundamental difference. There are also some other important differences. Now, when I do this in the U.S., I usually have something I can stand on top of to be really dramatic. But I don't think I have anything I trust to bear my weight here. So I'll just do this. This is less exciting. When I stand on top of something, this is a great demonstration because it's really exciting. So, what is another disagreement between Aristotle and Galileo? Aristotle says that heavier things fall faster than lighter things. Aristotle says that heavier things fall faster than lighter things. Why? Aristotle says that when something falls, what's happening is this thing is trying to reach its natural position in the universe, which is, in this case, the center of the universe. So if you want to know why does this move down when I let it go, it's trying to get to its natural location in the universe, trying to resume its qualitative state of being in its natural location. It's got a natural location, it's trying to get there. It's failing because it keeps hitting things that prevent it from getting to its natural location in space. And so if you have a really heavy thing, because there's lots of mass there, lots of material there, that's all trying to get to its natural place, of course it's going to fall faster. Of course, heavier things fall faster. There's more material that's all trying to get to its natural space. So if Aristotle is right, heavier things should fall faster than lighter things. Let's see if Aristotle's right. This is a light thing. This is a heavy thing. Aristotle's right. Galileo's wrong. Western science for the last 400 years, and sorry, the rest of the world followed the West's lead on this, because they shouldn't have done it, because you know what? Aristotle was right all along. All those heroic Chinese students who went to learn about Western science at the turn of the century, big mistake, because Aristotle was right all along. All this Galilean science, big mistake. I don't really think that. But we'll take a brief break, and then after the break, we'll see why Galileo might actually be right, and what that shows. So, Womishoshi Shan. So you got to know for a while, so you have throughout the world, both Chinese and Western, had made a mistake by following modern science. But it's just a joke, but it illustrates an important point. Aristotle said heavier things fall faster than light things, and in fact, that's often the case. Now, Galileo would say, well, but what you forgot to take account of is air resistance. Air resistance. Because of the resistance of the air, the paper flutters down, whereas the bottle of water, very little air resistance, and so it just zooms down. But this shows a further difference between Aristotle and Galileo, which is that Aristotle, again, notices certain He observes certain things, and for Aristotle, the case of motion when there is air resistance is central to his paradigm, whereas for Galileo, the case in which there is no air resistance is what's central. So, Galileo supposedly dropped two cannonballs of different weights from a high building to see which one would land first. And he found that they landed at the same time. Because they were cannonballs, the air resistance, the effect of the air, was the same on them. So even though the one cannonball was heavier than the other, they landed at the same time. And Galileo timed how fast they landed. And he did some other experiments, and he found that objects accelerate as they move towards the center of the Earth at 9.8 meters per second squared. That means that an object moves 9.8 meters per second when you first let go of it. After a second, it moves, what is it? It's 19.6 meters per second, and so on and so forth. Well, let's see if he's right. I specifically bought 2 bottles of water, and I have been drinking out of this one. I have not opened this one yet. They're identical, so the air resistance should be exactly the same. But this one is clearly heavier. So now we'll see. I've been doing this example for years. So far, the water's never exploded. Galileo's right. So for Galileo, the case where you ignore the air resistance is important case. For Aristotle, what's important is the case where you take into account the air resistance. Why did Galileo care so much about quantitative change? He cared so much about quantitative change because he had been reading Plato. Galileo cared so much about quantitative change because he had been reading Plato. The two foundational figures of Western philosophy are Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle's physics had been central, and his biology and his astronomy had been central to Western science for over 1,000 years. But Galileo had been reading Plato. Voila. And Plato says that the fundamental structure of the world is captured by numbers and by geometry. So influenced by Plato, Galileo was looking for numerical solutions, numerical answers, because that's what Plato said the structure of the universe was like. Now, what's the point, the basic point that Kuhn wants to convince you of in this chapter? So I should finish up with this. So when you look at a pendulum, part of the point that Kuhn is making is that what you see is part of this very complex framework of ideas. For Galileo, you're looking to find some kind of quantitative change that you can assign a number to. He finds one. He's looking for quantitative change because Plato said the secret to the universe is mathematics. Aristotle is looking for qualitative change, so a pendulum is not very interesting. It's just something trying to fall and being stopped again and again and again. That's all a pendulum is. not very interesting. And there's no reason to look for a mathematical or quantitative explanation of it, because that's not primarily what Aristotle cares about. So Galileo and Aristotle see a pendulum as something different. One sees it as a duck, one sees it as a rabbit. So what's the basic point that Kuhn is trying to convince you of in this chapter? And in fact, this is one of the points that Kuhn is trying to convince you of throughout the book. Let's remember our friend Russell. We shall say that we have direct acquaintance with anything of which we are directly aware, without the intermediary of any process of inference or knowledge of truths. And as many of you pointed out, one of the things, according to Russell, that we have direct acquaintance of is sense data. So according to Russell, there are sense data that we have direct acquaintance with. We know them directly. We know them without a need to know any truths. We know them without a need to engage in any process of inference or reasoning. We know them directly and purely. We know sensory truths directly and purely according to Russell. Kuhn says, what occurs during a scientific revolution is not fully reducible to a reinterpretation of individual and stable data. What does that mean? The individual and stable data would be something like sense data, as Russell understands. So Kuhn is saying, if we look at how science has actually developed, in fact, it is not the case that the sense data are immediately, directly available to us and fixed, and then we just give theories to explain them. We see something as a thing. We see it as a duck. We see it as a rabbit. We see it as a cube from above. We see it as a cube from below. We see it as a pendulum, or we see it as a stone trying to reach its natural place in the universe. We see something as a planet, or we see it as a comet. We see things as particular things in terms of our paradigm. So Kuhn's trying to convince us there's nothing like the sense data that Russell wanted us to believe in. And if that's right, it undermines not just Russell. Because Russell is a very influential 20th century philosopher, but he's just one philosopher after all. But Russell is a very clear example. The reason we read him is that Russell is a very clear example of modernism. Russell's a modernist, but he's part of a tradition that goes all the way back to Descartes. And out of that tradition, there are many different forms of the modernist tradition. But they all try to find something that is fixed and that cannot be doubted and that is given to us that can be the basis of knowledge. For Russell, it's direct acquaintance. But that's just one example. If Kuhn is right, all modernism is a mistake. Because all modernism tries to find something fixed that is given to us that we're directly acquainted with, that we can't doubt, that would be the basis of all other knowledge. Kuhn is saying nothing like that. So that's one of the main points of this chapter. Any questions about that? Yeah, please.
In Kuhn's book, he has talked about the concept of the immediate I want to know what's the distinction between this concept and Russell's sense data.
Yeah, good. Kuhn mentions the phrase immediate experience. And it's essentially the same as what Russell would mean by sense data. And actually, what Kuhn is saying about immediate experience is we don't really have access to. We have no immediate experience. We just have interpreted experience. Or if the only thing that's immediate would be, I see it as a duck. That's as immediate as it gets. Or I see it as a rabbit. That's immediate. Go ahead.
But before you see it as a duck, you have to see the lines.
Now, this is a good question. So, excellent question. Now, don't I have to see the lines before I see it as a duck? That's a very sensible suggestion. Now, there's a couple of ways of responding. One way of responding is, the simplest response I would give is to say, I'm not aware of seeing it as lines before I see it as a duck. So Russell thinks that we actually have an experience of sense data. And we can think about what sense data is and think about it without any interpretation. I think when I think about the duck rabbit, I see it first as something. And I don't see it first as lines and then decide they're lines that look like a duck or lines that look like a rabbit. So if I'm trying to describe what my actual experience is like, I think my experience isn't first seeing lines and then seeing, oh, those lines look like a rabbit. I think my experience is, well, I see something that looks like a duck, or it looks like a rabbit, or I see something that I can see is either a duck or a rabbit. Now, one way you could go is you could say, well, but Van Norden, surely you accept the scientific view that light comes from the fluorescent lights, bounces off the board, hits the retina in your eye, and sends a signal to your brain. I do accept that. But notice, when I just said that, I said that in accordance with the current scientific paradigm. So that account won't help me to get to sense data that I could use as a foundation for other knowledge. If I say, well, look, we know what happens. Light comes from things, bounces off things, hits your eyes, sends a signal to your brain. Okay, but then we're not modernists, we're scientists. We have a scientific theory. This theory is part of a paradigm. The paradigm tells us what exists in the world. And Kuhn would say, oh yes, you've got a theory about the world. I know you've got a theory about the world. That wasn't the question. So the trick about modernism, and if you've read Descartes, and if you haven't, Descartes' actually a lot of fun to read. You know, he's one of those people who's still kind of fun. Probably the best place to start is, his two most famous works are Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. But the Meditations is a lot of fun. I teach it a lot of times in my classes. But the point of it is to find something that you could ground or use as a foundation for all other knowledge. And if the idea is, well, then you have to be aware of sense data prior to seeing them as something. I'm not aware of doing that first. That's not what my experience is actually like. Like when I look at you, say, I don't see a bunch of shapes and color patches and then infer it's Hui Lin. I say, oh, that's Hui Lin, I know him. Yeah, he's a student in my class. Right? And I have expectations about what you're going to say, what your voice will sound like, things like that. You're already interpreted for me. You're already interpreted. I don't start with just shapes and colors and then construct out of that a belief in you. If Russell's right, somehow we do that, but I'm not aware of doing that. And then if you give a scientific account, I do accept the scientific account, but the scientific account is in terms of a paradigm. So you can't use it to justify paradigms because it's part of a paradigm. It is itself a particular paradigm. So those are ways you might respond. And I was saying this to the other class the other day. If you go on from this course and you rescue modernism, and you become the greatest defender of modernism, and you show how to answer objections of people like Kuhn, I will be the proudest teacher ever. If you rescue modernism, my research over the last 20 years is largely mistaken. But I will be so proud if you do that. Because as a teacher, my job is to get you to understand the issues and think about it. If you figure out how to save modernism, I would be surprised because I don't think it can be saved. But if you figured out how to do it, that would be terrific. So keep working on it if that is your sense that this has got to be right somehow. That Norden has missed something, where he's mistaken about something, he's overemphasizing something, he's underemphasizing something, he's missing a point, that's fine. My job is really just at getting to see these are the problems, and these are what people would start to say in response to some of the objections you might raise. Other questions about this? Those are excellent questions. That's an excellent question. So the question, if you can hear it, was, well, wait a second, this maybe sounds plausible if you focus on examples like the duck rabbit, where we know what a duck is supposed to look like, we know what a rabbit is supposed to look like. But what about something where you're not sure what you're looking at? And in fact, it seems like there are historical cases of this. Like, for example, the astronomers who looked at what we now know to be Uranus and didn't recognize what it was. What do we say about what was it that they were looking at? Here, still, what I want to suggest is they're still seeing it as something. They're seeing it, even if it's just as, I'm seeing it. I mean, part of the problem with Uranus is some astronomers we know from their reports, they were looking in the right place. They didn't report anything. Others were strong, so that's easy to handle because they didn't report the star at all. It was there, they just didn't see it. And I'm actually told, apparently this is a serious issue in astronomy, that apparently sometimes people will go back and realize they have photographic evidence of asteroids that are only discovered later. And so somebody had a photograph that had the asteroid on it, but early astronomers didn't notice it because it was tiny, or they just didn't expect to see it. So some astronomers looked, and they didn't see it as anything, but that's because they didn't see it. Other ones saw it, and they saw it, you're right, as just, well, this is a speck of light. But even seeing it as a speck of light, you have to interpret what a speck of light is in terms of your theory. So, for example, I could go out tonight and you could replace every star in the sky and every constellation with something different, I would not notice. I have almost no knowledge of observational astronomy. You might think I do because I'm talking about astronomy, but I actually just set me outside and said, identify a constellation or identify a star. Can't. Couldn't. You could change everything and nothing would look strange to me. Why? I have no paradigm for what the sky is supposed to look like. So even when the astronomers saw something but didn't recognize it as a new planet, they had to interpret it as something, and the fact that they reported it is different from me because I don't have a paradigm that would lead me to report anything. I mean, part of this is that even if a paradigm is wrong, and this is a point I wanted to stress, because this came up in some of your essays, part of the point Kuhn wants to make is even if we think a paradigm is wrong, if you didn't have the paradigm that turns out to be wrong, you couldn't come up with a better paradigm. So you can't just say, well, the earlier paradigm is just mistaken. It's not just mistaken, because without the earlier paradigm, nothing is an anomaly. Things are anomalies only against a paradigm. So if I look using a telescope, and you say, what do you see? I'm going to say, little, white spots. That's all I see. And I can say that, and that's a kind of interpretation, but it's a very thin one. But the astronomer won't. They'll say, I see fixed stars. I see, that's funny, that fixed star looks like it's in a different position from what it was last week. It must be a comet. And so they'll interpret it that way. But without that, it's nothing. It's gibberish. So, so even in the case of the earlier astronomers, they're seeing Uranus as something, if they're seeing it at all. And even when they see it incorrectly, it's necessary for them to see it as something for the anomaly to become apparent. Because if you don't see something as something, there's no anomaly. There's nothing to interpret. So let me go on a little bit, because these are excellent questions. What I want to talk about next is something that Kuhn refers to in passing. But again, it's one of those things that he thinks his readers will already know, but many of his readers will not know. And last time we talked about the covering law model. The covering law model of science. And there are still people who defend the covering law model of science. I don't think it's going to work personally, but there are people smarter than I am who think it will work, so maybe they're right. But Kuhn mentions in passing two other theories which you should probably know about, because although nobody believes in them now, they're historically important. And the fact that these next two theories failed can tell you a lot about science. The first theory, so I'm going to put a line here because the covering law model of science, still people working on this, trying to make it work. So there's still hope for that. Below the line, I think we got to give up. And most people think we got to give up below the line. One movement is logical positivism, sometimes called verificationism. Now, verificationism, if you look at the root of the word, it has to do with verified. Verified. So logical positivism, or verificationism, is the view that what's distinctive about science is that you can prove or verify science. So science is distinctive because you can prove what science says. And in particular, what was distinctive of the logical positivists, and the logical positivists, this was a movement in the early 20th century. And it included some of the most brilliant philosophers in the 20th century, philosophers like Rudolf Carnap. Some people classified Wittgenstein in his early work, not the later work of the philosophical investigation. But Wittgenstein's early work when he was working with Russell as logical positivism. A.J. Ayer, an American philosopher, was an early 20th century movement, logical positivism. And part of what's central to logical positivism is the claim that so one of the central claims of logical positivism or verificationism is that the meaning of a sentence is the method of proving it by appeal to experience. Now, Professor Lee will know I'm oversimplifying a little bit here, but it doesn't materially, it doesn't substantially affect the point. You get this idea, you get the basic idea. Now, so the idea behind logical positivism was to find it was both to explain how science works. Because the idea was, well, this is how science works. Science proves things by appeal to experience. By experience means something like sense data. And also, it was an effort to eliminate a lot of traditional philosophy. One of the major logical positivists, I mentioned his name a moment ago, was Rudolf Carnap. Carnap was a brilliant philosopher, really smart. So part of the point of logical positivism was to try to explain how science works. And they said, well, the method of science is that it proves things by appealing to experience, where experience is sense data. You just prove things based on sense data. Another aspect of logical positivism was that it wanted to say that most traditional philosophy is not false, but meaningless, because there's no way to prove it. So, Heitwan and I both are interested in Heidegger. But Rudolf Carnap wrote a famous essay called The Elimination of Metaphysics, which was a criticism of German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And Carnap said, I'm speaking as Carnap. Carnap said, I'm not saying that what Heidegger says is false. I'm saying that what Heidegger says is meaningless. Why would he say that? He said, because there's no method of proving what Heidegger said by appeal to experience. So, if we say something, and it's not just Heidegger, but it's all kinds of traditional thinkers. So think of some traditional philosophical claims, like in theology. Like if someone says, God is love. God is love. Shandish or Aichi, something like that. The logical positivist is going to say, it's not that the claim God is love is false. It's that it doesn't mean anything. God is love is the same as if I said you wouldn't say, I think that's false. And no one else would say, well, I don't know, I think that was true, personally. I think is a pretty good point. No, it's meaningless. It's just it's nothing. So logical positivists said most of traditional philosophy, it's not that it's false, and there's no point in arguing about it, because it's utterly meaningless. That includes pretty much all philosophy prior to the 20th century. All medieval philosophy, all medieval Western philosophy, all Chinese philosophy, all Indian philosophy, traditional philosophy, all meaningless. Why? You can't prove the claims using appeal to just experience, just sense data. And Carnap, like I say, absolutely scary brilliant guy. Incredibly brilliant, did amazingly brilliant work on this topic. Why? So you might like logical positivism, you might hate it, you might be curious. Why are there no logical positivists around anymore? Where'd they go? What happened to all logical positivists? Two problems. People like Carnap tried, Carnap, again, is a smart guy. He said, I'm not just going to say that science can prove things by experience. I'm going to show how it works. And so Carnap tried to do that. And he said, okay, I'm only going to appeal to direct experience and nothing else. Absolutely nothing except direct experience. Now, what do you get if you appeal to just sense data? You get statements like, "Red here now." That's pure sense data. No interpretation, no concepts, no truth, no inference directly given. Red here now. And of course, blue there. Now, Carnap did much better with this than you would think anybody could do. He got a lot closer to science. But if you've studied any science at all, and I know that there are different tracks in Chinese educational system, but even if you've read about science in just any book or have any knowledge of science at all, imagine getting to a scientific point, or just imagine any of the scientific theories we talked about in this course. Get to that theory from statements like, red here now, blue there then. Really is not clear how you're going to do that. Really is not clear at all. And geniuses like Carnap worked really hard at it, and they did not get close. Not even close. Like I said, farther than you think. You think you're getting nowhere. But they did put some things like, wow, that was really clever. How did you even get there that far? But basically, if you say, all you really know is experience, well, that's all you know by experience. Here's a color spot at this place at this time. Or here's a smell at this place at this time. Here's a feel at this place at this time. Go from that to Galileo, Newton, Einstein. Really not clear how to do it at all. I can go into details. Yeah, there's all kinds of problems. If you really want, you go into modality, it just goes through the sea. Don't even ask me about modality, because that's going to kill it. That's problem one. That if you really are serious about proving things based on only experience, you have such a small basis that it's not clear how to get science out of it, and no one's ever gotten close. No one's ever gotten close. Real science starts from observations of things, not sense data. Like, hey, I learned an interesting fact today. Did you know that neglecting air resistance, all objects fall at the same speed, even if they're heavy or light? Then when he showed us, he dropped a couple bottles, and I'll be darned, they landed at the same time. That whole thing was put in terms of objects, not sense data. Sense data is just stuff like this. Claims about bottles, those are concrete things. That's the first problem. Second problem, you're going to love this. So the basic claim of logical positivism is what? The basic claim of logical positivism is the meaning of a sentence is the method of proving it by appeal to experience. The meaning of a sentence is the method of proving it by appeal to experience. The meaning of a sentence is the method of proving it by appeal to experience. How do you prove this by appeal to experience? Ooh. In other words, if you apply the basic principle of logical positivism to the basic principle of logical positivism, it implies that the basic principle of logical positivism is meaningless. Right? Because what's the basic principle of logical positivism? If you can't prove a sentence based on experience, then all it means is how could I prove by appeal to experience that a sentence doesn't mean anything unless I can prove it by experience? I can't prove that by experience. What kind of experience would I look at to prove that? So, this principle, according to itself, is equivalent to a handful of logical positivists said, okay, we'll go with it. But then they didn't get any students. Because people said, I'm not following a philosophy whose basic principle is, according to the philosophy, meaningless. So that's why there are no logical positivists anymore. So this is a further reason why Kuhn rejects the notion that we can base science or base knowledge in general on sense data. If you actually try to do it, it's not clear how you could succeed. Because if you only start from sense data, you're going to be starting from very, very, very narrow, specific claims like that, and no one has figured out how to get from that to actual scientific claims, or even just claims about ordinary objects. A second philosophical position that Kuhn refers to in passing is a philosopher, and he had a position called falsificationism. So logical positivism, which I just talked about, is sometimes called verificationism. Karl Popper's view is falsificationism. And his view is that he passed away, a scientific theory is one that could be falsified. Now that sounds really strange at first. You might think, why? I thought the scientific theories were the ones that were supposed to be true. Why would they be the ones that could be falsified? Well, we'll look at that over break. And if you have any essays that you haven't given me yet, put them on Kyle, Women's Social Shop. We're going to actually, at the end of this class, and then on, October 21st, we'll talk about relativism. So, and that is an offensive view. One thing, though, two things. One, if you want to introduce a relativistic theory of truth, it's a good thing to make that explicit, because you can't assume that the reader will understand that. You need to make clear, I think this description could be true because he explicitly did that. Secondly, keep in mind, we're looking at Russell's account. Russell's account is not an attribution. So on Russell's account, the way in which you refer to something is by description that is actually true in a non-relative. And if we say that Priestley has knowledge by description, notice he doesn't have knowledge by description of oxygen. If truth is relative to paradigm, because oxygen is part of our paradigm, it's not part of Priestley's paradigm. So even if we say it's true that in his paradigm he's referring to phlogiston, that doesn't mean he has knowledge by description of oxygen, because oxygen is not part of his paradigm. Yeah, so once you relativize, then you can't say, well, so relatively true that there is phlogiston and phlogiston is oxygen, because that would not be relativistic. To say if gas is oxygen is not relative, it's non-relative. But that's a good question. So we started talking about Karl Popper's falsificationism, and it seems like a strange theory at first because he says a scientific theory is one that could be falsified. Normally, we think, well, a scientific theory is one we believe is true. So what does a theory being falsified have to do with it being scientific? What's the connection? But Karl Popper had an interesting idea. He said, what makes a scientific theory what makes a theory scientific as opposed to a non-scientific theory? What makes a theory scientific is that we could imagine a test that would show us the theory was false. That's not the same as showing that the theory is false right now. What makes the theory scientific is we know what kind of test would show that it was false, even if that test has not been performed yet. Now, what does he mean by that? Karl Popper, last time in talking about logical positivism, I said that a statement like God is love, or we could have added aesthetic statements like, I really like Levi. Right? And so, if he said something like Levi is one of the greatest poets the world has ever produced, I think that's true. Now, a logical positivist would say the statement Levi is one of the greatest poets the world has ever produced is the same as because you can't prove it by direct experience. Popper wouldn't say that. Popper would say, no, the claim that Levi is one of the greatest poets the world has ever produced, it could be true, it is meaningful, but it's not a scientific claim. Why? We can't think of a scientific test that would show that the claim is false. There's no test we could perform that would show, oh, well, I guess it's false that Levi is the greatest poet in the world. We tested, and it turns out Levi's not the greatest poet because we performed a scientific test. Doesn't make any sense. So, Popper says scientific theories are the ones that we know that it's possible to come up with a test that, depending on the result, would show it to be false. For example, Aristotle's theory about falling bodies is a scientific theory. Why? Well, we saw. Aristotle says objects that weigh different amounts, the heavier object should land first. Is there a test we could perform that could show that was false? Yes, this. And, yeah, that's it, I broke it. Matter of time. So Aristotle's theory about falling objects is a scientific theory because we know how to fall into them. However, Galileo's theory is also a scientific theory because we know tests that Galileo's theory could fail. For example, if I'd done that test and the heavier object landed first, that would have shown Galileo's view was false. So Popper says, so it's a scientific theory if you know how to show it's false. That doesn't mean that you show it's false. If you show it's false, well, it's a scientific theory that's false. The best scientific theories are the ones that you know what would show them false, but that never happens. You never find anything that shows they're false. And a large part of what Popper wanted to do is he wanted to get rid of things that he thought claimed to be sciences, but weren't really sciences. So, for example, Popper's opinion was that the teachings of Sigmund Freud, and this is true, Freud claimed that he was giving a scientific theory. But Popper said, no, Freud's theory is not a scientific theory because no matter what happens, there's nothing that a Freudian would admit had falsified the theory. So, for example, one of Freud's theories is that dreams are fulfillments of wishes. When you dream of something, you're actually dreaming of a wish that you would like to have. So every dream is somehow a wish you would like to have. But then people said, well, what about nightmares? Doesn't that falsify the theory? And Freud said, no, because some of the things you want, you're afraid of wanting. So Freud, part of his theory is, when you dream, the content of the dream is somehow a wish that you have. It's a desire or a hope you have. And people said, well, but people have nightmares. They have bad dreams. Doesn't that show your theory is false? And Freud said, no, because sometimes you want something, but you're afraid of wanting it. And that's why the nightmare is a nightmare. You still want something in the dream, but you're afraid of wanting it. You don't want to admit you want it. Popper said, look, whatever that is, it's not a scientific theory, because whatever you say, Freud will say, well, that's not an objection to my theory. I can explain anything you say. Also, Popper thought the same thing about Marx's theories. Marx's economic theories and Marx's historical theories. Popper said, whatever else they are, scientific materialism is not scientific. Because, Popper claimed, there's nothing that could happen that a Marxist would say, well, I guess you're right. That shows that Marxism was wrong. So, for example, Marx predicted that the advanced capitalist societies would eventually destroy themselves because the rich class would accumulate more and more wealth and reduce the wages of the proletariat lower and lower until eventually the proletariat could no longer afford to buy the goods that were produced by the factories of the rich capitalists. And it became a problem for Marx's view that the capitalist societies survived and seemed to flourish. And so, if you know your Marxism, you know Engels came along. Lenin. Lenin came along and said, no, what you're forgetting about is imperialism. The advanced capitalist societies force other countries to give them their wealth, and they use that to give money to their proletariat to keep their economy going. So Lenin wrote that imperialism is the next stage of advanced capitalism. But Karl Popper said, well, that just shows that a Marxist will adjust the theory, whatever evidence you give them, to make the theory sound acceptable. There's nothing that would count as evidence against it, so it's not a scientific theory. By the way, Karl Popper wrote a book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is a critique of anti-democratic societies from Plato, and he also thought that some Marxist-influenced societies were non-democratic. That was his opinion. And so people still read that book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. So it's an interesting kind of theory because something sounds right about it. You think, well, what makes a theory scientific as opposed to non-scientific? It seems like, well, yeah, the scientific theories, we know how to test them, and we know what would count as a result that would lead us to think, oh, well, that shows the theory's wrong. We're hoping not to discover that, but we know what a result like that would look like. So why have people given up Karl Popper's falsificationism as well? We can learn this just by reading Kuhn. Because the fact is that real scientific theories are very regularly changed to account for evidence that seems to falsify them. There's nothing which would be a complete, simple falsification of a scientific theory. Because you can always modify the theory to account for any result. Why do I say that? Well, if nothing else, you can say experimental error. So if nothing else, you can say our experimental equipment must be mistaken. It must have given us the wrong number. It must be misfunctioning. It must be malfunctioning. It must be working wrong. Or, well, most of the theory is okay. We just need to add this one qualification in this one area to take care of this special case. So, you can, let me give you an example. This is true. This is actually true. There is a society, and I have to admit, it's in the United States, and it's a society of people. I don't mean like a society like China's a society of nice. I mean like a group, like a club. There's like a group of people who believe the Earth is flat. They don't just as a joke. They really think the Earth is actually flat. Now, is that a scientific theory? Well, technically, in Popper's sense, it is. Remember, making something a scientific theory doesn't mean it's true. It just means you could falsify it. So the claim the Earth is flat, on Popper's terms, that is a scientific theory, wouldn't you think? Because, well, we could imagine how to falsify it. But how would you falsify it? Suppose I believe the Earth is flat. Argue. Why should I believe the Earth is not flat? You believe the Earth is not flat. Do you have any reason for believing that at all? You're thinking of something. Wait, go ahead. You just start it.
You can ride a spaceship, go to the outer space, and you can first.
I've never done that. I mean, I admit the people who are part of the global conspiracy to make us believe that the Earth is spherical claim to ride in spaceships. And they claim to have pictures of the Earth from space. But that's part of the conspiracy, the same conspiracy that produces the illusion that the United States landed on the moon. And this is part of what they'll say. Or they'll say, well, the apparent spherical nature of the Earth is an optical illusion caused by the gravity of the Earth, which bends light around the edges of the flat Earth. Now, the problem is, now this is, you'd say, well, okay, I guess it's not falsifiable. But the claim that the Earth is either flat or spherical, that's got to be a scientific claim one way or the other. Right? If we say it's a scientific claim that the Earth is a sphere, that means it's a false scientific claim that the Earth is flat. But if Popper's right, neither claim is scientific because you can always change the evidence, or you can always accommodate the evidence. So if we discovered that there was a conspiracy hiding from all of us the fact the Earth is flat, that would explain all the evidence. There are people who believe, I don't know, maybe you believe, I don't know. There are people who believe the United States, very few. But there are some who think, we never landed on the moon. Come on! Ridiculous landing on the moon. It's crazy talk. It's all a big fraud. It's a big conspiracy. It was done with, it's like special effects, like in a science fiction movie. It's not real. Any theory can be maintained, no matter what evidence, if you are clever enough to adjust other parts of the theory. So the reason people don't hold Popper's view is even ordinary scientific theories get modified all the time when they discover anomalies to try to account for them. So the fact that a theory is adjusted in the light of anomalies can't show whether it's scientific or not. because all theories are adjusted in the light of anomalies. Last thing I want to talk about, do a little quickly, but this is pretty interesting stuff, I think. This last topic. Now, generally speaking, relativism is the view that truth or falsity depends on your perspective. For some kinds of cases, relativism is clearly true. Why do I say that? Door on the left or the right? It's on my left, it's on your right. There's no objective fact about whether the door is on the left or the right. Left and the right are relative to your perspective. So are up and down. If you ask, is there a floor above this one? If I ask that question on this floor, the answer is no. It's false that there is another floor above this one if you ask it on this floor. If you ask on the second floor, it's true that there is a floor above this one. So in some cases, relativism is obviously true, like terms like left, right, up, down, things like that. But those aren't the most interesting cases. The interesting cases are when we're talking about ethical issues or, more broadly, cognitive issues. And when we talk about ethical relativism or cognitive relativism, we can further subdivide it into cultural or subjective. I'm going to focus on this category in here. So, relativism is the view that truth and falsity depends on your perspective. Cognitive relativism is the view that for descriptive claims in general, descriptive claims of all kinds, they all depend for their truth or their falsity on your perspective. So not just left and right, up and down, but all claims, according to the cognitive relativist, depend for their truth or falsity on your perspective. What does that mean? Well, for example, the sun is a planet. According to the view of Aristotle, the claim that the sun is a planet is true. The planets on Aristotle's view, go around the Earth. On Aristotle's view, the sun goes around the Earth. So on Aristotle's view, from his perspective, it's true that the sun is a planet. From Galileo's perspective, it's not true the sun is a planet. From Galileo's perspective, it's true that the Earth is a planet, and not true, it's false that the sun is a planet. Now, it's easy to misunderstand cognitive relativism. Cognitive relativism is not simply claiming that people believe different things relative to their perspectives. We already know that. That's not an interesting or exciting or controversial claim. We know that Aristotle believes the sun is a planet. We know that Galileo believes the sun is not a planet. So that's not controversial. The cognitive relativist says, if you ask, is the sun a planet, technically speaking, if we're careful, There's no answer to that question unless we specify whose perspective we're taking. It is true from the perspective of Aristotle that the sun is a planet, just like it is true from my perspective that the door is on the left. It is false from the perspective of Galileo that the sun is a planet, just like it is false from your perspective that the door is on the left. Actually false, not just you believe it's false. Actually true, not just you believe it's true. And there are some things that might lead you to be a cognitive relativist. So, for example, we've been reading Kuhn. What is Kuhn telling us? Kuhn has been telling us that the way you see the world is determined by your paradigm. There's no way to experience the world except in terms of a paradigm. This might lead you to think that Kuhn's point is that truth is relative to paradigms. So relative to the paradigm, in other words, relative to the culture of which Aristotle and his later followers were a part, the sun is a planet. Relative to the culture of which Galileo and we are a part, the sun is not a planet. Really. Why? Because that's the paradigm that we operate on. And independently of the paradigm, there's no truth or falsehood. Kuhn comes really close to saying exactly this. For example, sorry, I meant to write this up. Break between classes, but I forgot to do so. I'm sorry. Just let me write up something that is really cool. Kuhn writes, page 111, the historian of science may be tempted to exclaim. To exclaim is to yell out in excitement. That when paradigms change, the world itself changes with them. That was me exclaiming that. The historian of science may be tempted to exclaim that when paradigms change, the world itself changes with them. It sounds like what Kuhn is saying is there's not a fixed world that's in any way objective. There are just worlds as interpreted by paradigms. So there's truth relative to this cultural paradigm, there's truth relative to that cultural paradigm. Many things Kuhn says suggest this view. And many people have read Kuhn and have been led by Kuhn to become cognitive relativists. Why might we resist that? Well, it all comes back to Plato. Plato keeps showing up no matter what you do. He's always there, hiding in the background. Something interesting to say on every topic. And Plato, in his dialogue, the Theaetetus, this is the same dialogue in which Plato gives the definition of knowledge as justified true belief, which we mentioned became kind of the standard definition of knowledge for Western philosophers for 2,000 years. But in the same dialogue, Plato talks about cognitive relativism. And here's what Plato asks the famous question. Is cognitive relativism itself only relatively true, or is it objectively true? So cognitive relativism says Well, all truth depends on your perspective. Then what if we say, does that truth depend upon a perspective? Now, if you say, no, this is the one objective truth, that doesn't seem fair. Whatever reason you have for believing all the other truths are relatively true, if it's a good reason, it should apply to this too. So it doesn't seem like it could be right to say, well, every other truth that anybody else says is relative, but my theory is objectively true. That just doesn't sound plausible at all. So it seems like you can't say, well, no, cognitive relativism is itself objectively true. Then what do you say? Well, you have to say cognitive relativism is only relatively true. Only true from some perspectives. But then if cognitive relativism is only true from some perspectives, then from my perspective, it's absolutely objectively false. That's my perspective. So therefore, cognitive relativism is objectively false. How do I know that? It said it was relatively true. My perspective is that it's objectively false. Therefore it is. So what Plato revealed is cognitive relativism seems to undermine itself. It seems to destroy itself. Because if you ask of cognitive relativism, is it itself relative or objective? It seems there's no reason for saying it's objectively true itself. Because if the claim is that everything else is relative, how can this one thing be objective? So, if cognitive relativism is true at all, it has to just be an opinion, true only from some perspectives. Fine. My opinion is this is absolutely false, and we don't have to waste any time on it. And according to this doctrine, I'm right. That's what the doctrine says. The doctrine says, if I think that from my perspective, it's true. Well, I think from my perspective, the doctrine's not worth thinking about. Therefore, that's true. That seems crazy too, but that's the problem. The doctrine undermines itself. Now, what does all this have to do with Kuhn? Well, remember, we were saying Kuhn keeps saying stuff like, for one example, he says stuff like, the historian of science may be tempted to exclaim that when paradigms change, the world itself changes with it. That makes it sound like Kuhn's point is that truth depends on your paradigm. Now, Kuhn wrote this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, telling us how scientific revolutions occur, and telling us that previous historians were mistaken in their understanding of how scientific change occurs, and telling us that previous philosophies of science, like logical positivism and Karl Popper's falsificationism, are mistaken as well. Isn't that just another paradigm? In other words, isn't Kuhn's own view just another paradigm? But if Kuhn's view is just another paradigm, why should I believe it? Why don't I just adopt a paradigm in which Kuhn's view is false? And why can't I do that? Another way of putting it is, on the one hand, it looks like Kuhn is saying, hey, guess what? All the other historians were wrong about science. I'm right about it. And guess what I discovered? What I discovered is there's no fact about reality. Well, if there's no fact about reality, Kuhn, how are you right about reality? If you're right, Kuhn, nobody's right. There's just different paradigms. So the problem with any effort to be a cognitive relativist is when you announce the doctrine of cognitive relativism, you're committing yourself to a view about the world. But the view you're committing yourself to about the world is that no view about the world is actually correct. It's just there are only different perspectives on what the world is like. But that would apply to Kuhn's own theory. So Kuhn's own theory would just be one paradigm. Really simply, the question we're asking is, Kuhn seems to say that truth depends on your paradigm. Isn't that theory itself just a paradigm? And if it's just a paradigm, why don't we adopt a different paradigm in which it's not true? Why isn't that open to us as a possibility? In the part of Kuhn's structure that I'm going to have you read not this upcoming Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that, October 21st, Kuhn discusses how do people resolve disagreements about paradigms. And in the postscript, he tries to explain why he's not a relativist. So in the postscript, Kuhn tries to explain, he says, look, people mistakenly thought I was a relativist, Kuhn says. I'm not a relativist. Here's why I'm not a relativist. And you can see for yourself why Kuhn thinks he's not a relativist. But when you read what he says, it's not clear it helps you. So in these sections, you're going to read for, not for, again, there's no homework for this upcoming the upcoming Tuesday. Just a lecture, writing well and publishing in U.S. academic journals. Some other people will come listen to. But the Tuesday after that, the reading is going to be a chapter where Kuhn talks about how people with different paradigms end up reaching an agreement. And then in the postscript, he tries to explain why he's not a relativist. At some point soon, I'll put up on the QQ group a homework essay for that week, which isn't for a couple of weeks yet, and some discussion questions to guide your reading as well. You don't have to write anything out for the discussion questions. They're just things to think about that I might ask you to say something in class, like, hey, what does somebody think about this question? But I'll put these up on the QQ group. So I'll put up eventually a homework essay to go with this reading and discussion questions to go with this reading. But for this upcoming Tuesday, no homework. Just show up for that lecture. I think we're about out of material, so 今天我们就到这儿。上个星期再见。